Thank you, Father Berg, and thank you all for inviting me here. I'm particularly grateful to Sheila St. John for organizing all of this. It's just a wonderful turnout, and it's a great sign of hope, I think, in our church in the United States that so many of you are here to celebrate Humanae Vitae. What I would like to do with you for the next 40 minutes or so is to take a walk through the life of John Paul II, exploring how he came to understand the integrity of love in a singular combination of pastoral experience and intellectual reflection, which I think made his teaching on marriage and the family so distinctively powerful. The story really begins on March 17th, 1949. On that day, the Archbishop of Krakow, Cardinal Adam Stefan Sapieha, assigned a young priest named Karol Wojtyła, a recently minted doctor of theology returned from Rome, to the parish of St. Florian, just north of the Old City in Krakow, the traditional parish of the Catholic intellectuals of Krakow, to begin a second center of campus ministry in the Archdiocese. Sapieha knew that the battle for the future of Poland, in which he was engaged with the communist government of Poland, was a battle for the hearts and minds and souls of Poland's young people. And he wanted this dynamic, intellectually acute young priest to start from scratch a second center of campus ministry in the diocese. It's hard for us, for those who never lived under a communist regime, to fully appreciate what a hard job Cardinal Sapieha had laid on young Father Wojtyła. We are in 1949 at the beginning of the worst period of Stalinist repression in Poland. Bishops, priests, and religious by the hundreds are in prisons or labor camps. Social control was maintained by the regime through a deliberate attempt at atomizing society and keeping people apart. Apartments were built, but they were built very small. No large families. Work schedules were arranged so that fathers and mothers, husbands and wives didn't have a lot of time together. Ferrets and spies were everywhere. In the university environment in which Father Wojtyła was to work, most students did not know the last names, the surnames of their classmates. It was dangerous to know too much about anybody because you never knew who was working for somebody else. In that atomized, repressive, dangerous environment, this young priest, just returned from 2 years of doctoral studies in Rome, does some serious retail evangelization. He goes literally door to door in the dormitories, the religious houses where students lived, inviting them to meet him and to meet each other. In all of this, he's breaking taboos, not just the taboos of a communist regime, but the taboos that generally surrounded clergy in Poland in those days, where there was a real gap between priests and their people. He told these young people, when they asked him, "What shall we call you?" because it would be imprudent to call him father, since organized Catholic youth activities were completely forbidden by the regime. He said, "Call me uncle. Call me uncle," wujek in Polish. He took them skiing, kayaking, hiking, celebrating Mass in the woods. He organized study groups of young people who wanted to probe the meaning of Catholic faith more deeply. He was creating zones of freedom, free space where young people could speak from the heart about what was most important to them. And he discovered in the course of that their most urgent questions did not have to do with the existence of God. These were all Catholic kids, even though they were growing up in an officially atheistic environment. The urgent question wasn't about the existence of God. Their urgent questions were about love and how to make a good marriage and how to form good families in these extraordinary circumstances of a repressive communist state. As the network of these Wojtyła kids began to expand, quite naturally couples began to form. Out of those couples, marriages came, and out of those marriages, children came. And Father Wojtyła, as he continued to accompany these young people through life, was always there. He would celebrate their weddings. He would baptize their children. He would go to the home, the apartment, after the baptism, because he knew that welcoming a child into the church was not simply a matter of a sacramental ceremony, but welcoming them into the family of the church. And he was always challenging these young people. One of them told me 20 years ago that I spoke to him for hundreds of hours, this man said, about everything, and not once did he ever tell me what I should do. He would throw light on a problem, he would illuminate it, but then the signature phrase in his spiritual direction was, "You must decide. You must decide." He was gently compelling decisions, good decisions. And out of all of this, work over the better part of a decade. Karol Wojtyła, the man who would become John Paul II, said, "I learned to love human love. I learned to love human love." It's in these real-life interactions with young people that the Pope of the family, as he was called on the day of his canonization, learned to love human love. Cardinal Sapieha's decision in 1949 to take the risk of asking this young priest to start what amounted to an illegal campus ministry in Krakow has had effects that are still being felt in the church today. In July 2014, 4 years ago, I was teaching in Krakow, as I do every July, and two of the old Wojtyła kids, two of the members of this network of friends built around wujek, were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. And they invited me and my son, who was with me, to take some photographs for the book we were writing together on Krakow, a kind of spiritual guidebook to the city. to the anniversary Mass, which was in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel at Wawel Cathedral, where 50 years before, then Archbishop Wojtyła in 1964 had celebrated their wedding Mass. It was a lovely occasion. Something liturgical that our priest friends here might want to consider. I noticed that when they renewed their marriage vows, they are, of course, holding each other's hands, but the priest receiving those renewed vows wrapped his stole around their joined hands. A very nice, interesting gesture. In any event, after the Mass, outside in the courtyard of Wawel Cathedral, there were 70 or 80 people there who had attended the Mass. I would say 90% of them were from this środowisko, this network of friends of Father Wojtyła going back to the late 1940s and early 1950s. And my son and I were standing off to the side while the anniversary couple was being presented with flowers and more flowers, which is the Polish custom on these occasions. And I said to my son, you know, you're looking at the beginning of World Youth Day. World Youth Day did not begin in Rome in 1984. World Youth Day began with these people when they were kids in the late 1940s and early 1950s. That decision of Cardinal Sapieha to assign young Father Wojtyła to campus ministry also had a tremendous impact on the Church's understanding of and presentation of its ethic of human love. That network of young friends that began in his campus ministry days was then complemented by another network of young friends formed during the years when he taught philosophy at the Catholic University of Lublin, several hours east of Krakow. And out of that combination of interactions, the Krakowian kids and the kids in Lublin, where he was not just a professor, but a confessor and a spiritual director and a pastor, out of those two experiences came the book, Love and Responsibility, as his reflection on what he had learned from helping prepare these young people to deal with what he had learned in the late 1940s were really their most urgent questions. How to live, love in integrity, how to make a good marriage, how to raise a good family. And in that book, Love and Responsibility, which was published in 1960, there are key themes that would endure in his teaching on family and marriage and the integrity of love for the next 4.5 decades. That book asks the question, how is our love a truly human love? And then he gives the answer. Our love is a truly human love when it is a gift of self to another, not the use of another. Thus, a truly human love, as he puts it in Love and Responsibility, is a meeting of two freedoms. Two freedoms meet together, seeking the good. And the Church's sexual ethic, lived faithfully, lived as the meeting of two freedoms, seeking the good, transforms sexual love from the instinctive to the truly human, and by transforming it from the instinctive to the truly human, it raises human love to the level of the spiritual. To give oneself to another fully is to express human love in its fullness, for this mirrors the divine love, the love within the Holy Trinity, and the love that God expresses outside of himself in his creative and redeeming action in the world. These themes from love and responsibility were crucial in shaping Karol Wojtyła's unique approach to what became the encyclical Humanae Vitae. During the Second Vatican Council, particularly its third and fourth sessions, Pope Paul VI had become increasingly impressed with this intelligent, personable, dynamic young bishop from Poland. And as he reformed the Papal Commission on Marriage and Family that had been created by Pope John the 23rd, he asked then Archbishop Wojtyła to become a member of that commission after the council. Wojtyła was unable to attend the meetings of this commission in Rome because the communist government of Poland would not give him a visa. So what he did instead was to set up his own commission in Krakow, made up of theologians, philosophers, physicians, psychologists, to examine all of these problems of marriage and the family in the modern world, and to then make some proposals to the Pope on what he might say about that. One of the members of that commission, an elderly priest named Andrzej Bardecki, described to me at some length 20 years ago what they had done. They had examined two proposals for an encyclical that had been submitted to Paul VI. One of them, Father Bardecki told me, was simply, as he put it rather bluntly, stupid conservatism. It was simply a repetition of old papal statements in a kind of compendium without any argument and without any indication of understanding that the terms of the discussion had really changed in a fundamental way because of the invention of the oral contraceptive pill. Then there was another proposal for an encyclical that the Krakow theologians believed would simply empty Catholic moral theology of its content. Because that encyclical, that draft of an encyclical, coming primarily from Germany, abandoned the notion that there are intrinsically evil acts, things that are just wrong because of what they are, and tried to substitute instead a kind of calculus of proportion. You know, there's what you do, but then there's what you intend, and then there are the consequences, and you put all that into the Cuisinart, and you measure it against the horizon or the trajectory of an entire moral life, and you get some sort of a moral decision. This is called, in the technical vocabulary of moral theology, proportionalism, and the Krakowian theologians understood that to go down that road was to empty Catholic moral theology of its content. And as Wojtyła would later say, to empty the moral life of its drama. If there are no intrinsically evil acts, then there's no drama to the moral life. The moral life involves the struggle, often difficult, to avoid those things which are just wrong, and that no combination of intentions and consequences can make right. So the first thing the Krakowian Commission said in its report to Pope Paul VI was there's got to be a better way here. There has to be an alternative to simply repeating doctrinal formulas from the past, often in a language that really didn't communicate with the contemporary world. And there has to be an alternative to this proportionalism that would empty individual acts of their meaning. And the alternative they proposed was to frame or position the Church's teaching on the appropriate means of regulating fertility in a thoroughly humanistic context. So they made several suggestions. First, the encyclical should emphasize the good of marital love in itself, not only as a means to procreation. The unitive and procreative dimensions of human love within the bond of marriage should be equally emphasized. Secondly, the encyclical should make clear that family planning is a moral responsibility. The Church does not teach an ethic of fertility at all costs. The Church teaches the exercise of the virtue of prudence in planning one's family, but urges couples to be open to the transmission of life in their prudent decisions as to how to plan their families. And the encyclical should then stress that family planning, according to the natural rhythms of fertility, is most congruent with human dignity, and especially the dignity of women. And the regulation of fertility through the natural rhythms of the body is most expressive of the integrity of love. So, that report went to Pope Paul VI, and Humanae Vitae did do some of what the Krakowian Commission recommended, as all of you who will have read the document will recognize. However, it would have been difficult to find a more awful year for Humanae Vitae to land than 1968. I mean, those of you my age know that 1968 was as bad as it gets. There was this terrible sense of unraveling all over the Western world. Irrationality, passion, in the worst sense of passion, rejection of all forms of traditional authority, religious, political, whatever, was epidemic throughout the Western world. So no matter how compellingly Paul VI made the case for natural family planning as the morally appropriate means of regulating fertility and living responsible parenthood, that was simply not going to be heard in that environment. And as I pointed out in my Catholic Press column 2 days ago, that problem was exacerbated even more by bishops' conferences around the world abandoning the Pope to his critics, of which the Canadian bishops and the German bishops were perhaps the two most sorry examples. That was 1968. 10 years later, Karol Wojtyła becomes, quite unexpectedly, Pope John Paul II. And he brings to the papacy a conviction that the Church was facing in the sexual revolution a new Galileo crisis. And a response to the sexual revolution had to be articulated, that would be fresh, imaginative, and something that people living in the late modern world could hear and engage and consider. And out of that conviction, John Paul II decided to put marriage and the family at the center of his pastoral teaching. The first example of this came in 1980 with the Synod of Bishops meeting on the family, which led a year later to the Apostolic Exhortation Familiaris Consortio, the community of the family. And there, to take but one theme, John Paul II lifts up the family as something far more than a biological unit or a sociological fact. The family, he writes, is a domestic church. The ecclesiola, the little church. The family is a domestic church. And to think of the family that way is to lift this whole discussion of marriage and the family onto a different plane. But as important as Familiaris Consortio was, what the Pope began the year before the Synod on the Family and continued from 1979 to 1984 was even more important. And that was the development and articulation of what we have come to know as the theology of the body. There is too much material there, and there's too little time here to go through the whole thing in detail. But I do want to highlight some of its key themes, which develop some of the themes I've already noted in love and responsibility. The first of these in the theology of the body is that the body is not just a machine that we inhabit. This is a very bad contemporary idea. The body is a machine that the real me can do anything with, including, evidently, these days, look in the mirror after you get out of the shower in the morning and tell yourself you're something other than what you manifestly are. Body's a machine. You can swap out the tires, give it a new paint job. Looks like a guy. Now it's not. The body is not just a machine we inhabit. The body expresses who we are, and the body acts out decisions that are not accidental or peripheral to who we are. All of which is to say that the body makes visible the invisible. The body makes visible the spiritual dimension of who we are. The body, in that sense, is sacramental. Okay? What's a sacrament? A sacrament is an ordinary thing, water, bread, wine, through which the extraordinary, the saving grace of the Holy Spirit, the real presence of the risen Lord Jesus, comes into the world. In the Catholic sacramental imagination, we might call it, the extraordinary lies just on the far side of the ordinary. And it's through the ordinary that the extraordinary comes into our lives. And that's true of marital love and fidelity as well. Second key point in the theology of the body develops one of the central teachings of the Second Vatican Council, found in paragraph 24 of the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes in the Latin title, where the Council Fathers teach that we come into the fullness of our humanity by making our lives into a gift for others rather than asserting ourselves against others. The insight here is both simple and terribly important. None of us is the cause of our own existence. We didn't make us to be. Our lives, the lives of each one of us in this room, the 800 people at this conference, each one of those lives is a gift to the person who's living it. The Fathers of Vatican II understood, and Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, understood that that's not simply a biological fact, that is a deep spiritual and moral truth. Because from that we learn that the royal road to beatitude, to happiness, to human flourishing lies in taking that gift that my life is to me and making it into a gift for others. This is profoundly countercultural in contemporary society when it's all assertion all the time. But it's a deep truth inscribed in the human condition. And if that's true of who we are, then John Paul II writes in the Theology of the Body, then the original sin is to violate this law of the gift, this law of self-giving built into us, and we do that when we turn the other into an object, when we turn the other, another human being, into something to be used. This, by the way, is John Paul II's interpretation of the fall of Adam and Eve. When they shifted from giving to using, then they get nervous, remember? And they go out to Banana Republic or wherever they would get the stuff they put on. This is a tough crowd. Nobody laughs at anything. Okay, when shame comes into the world, when self-gift becomes use of the other. That means that to reduce love to lust is a terrible mistake. Love is not lust. Love is desire, desire for the other lived as the gift of self for the good of the other. And that means, John Paul II writes in the Theology of the Body, that purity of heart, blessed are the pure of heart. The purity of heart means to live married love as self-gift and receptivity. And then, in the third volume of the Theology of the Body, John Paul II takes that insight about as far as it can possibly go when he says that married love, lived in integrity, is an icon of the Holy Trinity. And therefore, marriage is the primordial sacrament because it's through the self-gift and receptivity of marriage that we begin to get our first glimpses of the interior life of God himself. For what is God the Holy Trinity? God the Holy Trinity is a communion of self-gift and receptivity. God is with us because God is with in the interior life of God himself. And that interior life of God is a communion of self-gift and receptivity, which is mirrored, embodied, if you will, in the world through human love within the bond of faithful and fruitful marriage. Catholic Church, for the past 50 years, if not longer, has been accused of being prudish, nervous about human sexuality, ununderstanding. You know all of the indictment. Do you know any other account of human love that says married love is an icon of the interior life of God himself? I mean, that's not aiming low, that's aiming very, very high. So in all of this, really going back to his work with those young students in Krakow in the late 1940s and early 1950s, where, by the way, long before the summer of free love existed up the road in San Francisco, the communist regime was encouraging promiscuity, another way of atomizing society. In all of this, from the late 1940s through the Theology of the Body, John Paul II, and through him the Catholic Church, are saying to the sexual revolution, we will see you and raise you. We will see you and raise you. You think of human sexuality as simply another contact sport. We think of it as the embodiment in the world, the first human insight into the interior life of God himself. Who's got the higher view? Who's got the nobler view? Who's got the more humane view? Who's got the more humanistic view? That's what the Theology of the Body offers, and that's why I think it has been such an extraordinary gift to the Church. There is a sense in which Humanae Vitae was a prophetic and heroic act in its own right, but one of its most important long-term effects was to compel the articulation of the theology of the body as a fuller explication of the truths that were taught by Paul VI 50 years ago. In all of that, we're not just simply saying to the sexual revolution, we'll see you and raise you. We're shifting the question. We're shifting the moral question from a no to a yes. We're shifting the question from what am I forbidden to do to how do I live a life of sexual love that conforms with my dignity as a human person. That's the prior question. That's the prior question. And our answer to that is that we live it monogamously through indissoluble marriage. We live it in fidelity. We live it in fruitfulness. And out of that fruitfulness comes that ecclesiola, that little church, that domestic church that images God in the world, and through which the children who are part of that little church get their first insight into the nature of God himself. They get it from mom and dad. They get it from seeing a communion of self-gift and receptivity. Now, in order to live that life of the integrity of love means not doing some stuff. So the question, what am I not to do, has not disappeared, but it's now been located in a larger context. What am I here for? Am I here for a noble purpose? Or am I here to play contact sports all the time? The power of all of this, I think, is demonstrated by looking around the world church today. The living parts of the Catholic Church throughout the world, I think there are no exceptions to this, are the parts that have embraced the magisterium of John Paul II and Benedict XVI as the authentic interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, and included within that authentic interpretation is the fuller explication of the truths of Humanae Vitae that we get from the Theology of the Body and Familiaris Consortio and all of the rest of that wonderful body of teaching. And the dying parts of the church are the parts that are still locked in the old question, the old paradigm, the failed project that I began calling 16 years ago Catholic Light. Catholic Light doesn't work. Catholic Light doesn't work for a very obvious reason. Catholic Light is boring. The question, how little do I have to believe and how little do I have to do to somehow remain within the communion of the church, is a boring question. It's a boring question. There's nothing particularly interesting in that. As Bishop Barron demonstrated in that magnificent series of his Catholicism, which I think is the greatest visual presentation of the faith ever accomplished, there is so much more here to wrap your head around, to give your heart to enrich your soul by. So the living parts of the church around the world are those parts that have embraced what I have come to call now all-in Catholicism, and the dying parts are the parts that keep trying to make Catholic Light work. All-in Catholicism is not, or certainly should not be, arrogant or self-satisfied. None of us lives the lives we're called to. But as John Paul II said to young people for 25 years, never lower the bar of expectation. You have, by the grace of God, the capacity for spiritual and moral grandeur. Grace of God makes that possible in your life. You're not going to meet that standard all the time. You are going to fall. Falling is not an excuse or reason for lowering the bar. When you fall, which you will, get up, dust yourself off, go to confession, seek reconciliation and forgiveness, and then try to conform yourself more completely to what the grace of God is doing in your life. But don't lower the bar of expectation. Parts of the church that have embraced that are the parts that are living. It's true in the United States. Living dioceses, parishes, lay renewal movements, religious communities, seminaries, etc., campus ministries. Certainly true in Africa, the fastest growing part of the world church today, where the church's teaching on marriage and the family has come as a great liberating force, especially for the liberation of women. It's true in those admittedly too rare parts of the church in Western Europe today. But wherever the church is growing, it's growing because the seed has fallen into enriched soil. The seed has not fallen onto the stony ground of Catholic Light. One other thought here. John Paul II was acutely aware from this pastoral experience that I've described in some detail, that everyone, whether they know it or not, wants to live a life of integrity and love. If you don't have a true idea of what that means, you're going to follow false ideas, because the instinct to do that, the instinct to find love is hardwired into us. So if that instinct doesn't find a true object, a true goal, it's going to find false goals and false objects. And that's pretty much what the culture is offering around us today. So when we see people unable to form relationships, when we see people caught in various internet traps of fake love, when we see a feminism in our culture that denies what is most distinctive and about women and what gives women their unique and glorious dignity, by saying, unless I can dispose of this life within me, I am not a full human being. This is completely crazy. You're going to hear it for the next 6 weeks during the Kavanaugh hearings. We're going to get our noses rubbed in the notion that the abortion license is essential to the dignity and equality of women. When we hear all of this bad stuff or experience it, the salaciousness of advertising, the garbage in so much of popular culture, we should remember with John Paul II that while there is certainly wickedness at work here, and wickedness meaning Satan, the evil one, at work here. The evil one works through human instincts for the good. He just twists them so that they're false objects rather than true objects. So we have to learn to speak to this crazy culture in order to say, we think we understand what you're looking for, but we think you're doing it in a way that's destructive, that's not going to make you happy, because we're in the happiness business. The Magna Carta of Catholic moral theology and Catholic ethics is the Beatitudes. That's where it all starts. Beatitude is the goal of the moral life. If we can learn to reframe these truths that it's been given to us to live in this very difficult and challenging time, we may just get a hearing. We may just get a hearing. People are beginning to connect the dots. My friend Mary Eberstadt, whose work many of you know, has brilliantly run the analysis, the string from Paul VI's warnings about a contraceptive culture and what its destructive impacts would be, to the Me Too movement, and with the abortion license squarely in the middle. Okay, that's beginning to get a hearing. So, if we can display in our own lives the joy of the gospel, the joy of love, the joy of living in the truth, no matter how challenging it can be at times, and it can be challenging, then I think we're at a moment where the truths that Paul VI taught so heroically can be heard again and might be able to help give our country and our world a new birth of freedom, rightly understood. Thanks very much. Thank you. According to my watch, we have 5 minutes, so despite the fact that I cannot see anybody or very few people, thanks to these lights back here, Father Berg, is the idea that people will come up to the microphone?
That is the idea.
That's good. I won't be able to
Make
see
sure it
them,
works,
but I
yeah.
will hear them. Okay.
Thank you very much for your insights and for all your work. I hope I get this right. If I understand correctly, Humana Vitae, the material for it was pulled together by 65, but not promulgated until 68. Is that correct?
No, I mean, you can talk to Janet Smith about this, who knows more about this than anybody on the planet. This was an ongoing process. And by the time these Krakowians get into the game in 66, 67, there are 2 drafts that I'm aware of floating around. And they're both bad or inadequate. I mean, one's awful and the other is inadequate. So out of all of that comes Humanae Vitae. That's the way encyclicals are written. And any notion that some people are floating that, well, you know, this developed over time, therefore maybe it's susceptible to further development, meaning denial, just don't know how this stuff works. I mean, it's an ignorant thing. So no, there was a lot of stuff in the Cuisinart here.
So between 65 and 68 would be the time that maybe the Krakowian group were looking at both sides. And it's just been a mystery to me, that period of time, and I appreciate your insights.
Well, look at typical author's temptation. In Witness to Hope, I have the precise dates of that Krakowian memo and when it was sent, so you can kind of roll it back from there. I think I may have been the first person to publish that memo beyond Poland. I found it in a dusty library in an obscure theological journal. I think I must have swallowed a pound of antihistamines after digging this thing out. My head was just going nuts. It's a very impressive document, and I quote it at some length in the book, so you might want to take a look at that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
I hope you don't mind that I make a comment since you mentioned Kavanaugh. Andrew Napolitano has defended Catholics to determine the size of their own family. I think that's wonderful. He doesn't just talk about abortion, but actually for Catholics to determine, or not just Catholics, but he's defended Catholics to have large families, or whatever size family.
Sure.
So I just wanted to say I wish that Donald Trump would have appointed Andrew Napolitano instead of Kavanaugh.
Don't worry about Judge Kavanaugh. He'll be fine.
Hi. My question is, what is the role of Humanae Vitae and the theology of the body in the new evangelization? Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's very important. The new evangelization is the grand strategy of the Catholic Church in the 21st century and the third millennium. And at the center of that, or at least very close to the center of that, particularly in our part of the world, has got to be an address to this deconstruction of what it means to be a human being that we see going on all around us. The notion that human beings are infinitely plastic and malleable, that you can make yourself into anything your will desires, we now have irrefutable scientific evidence does not make for happiness or flourishing. And we have to, I think the theology of the body helps us do this, in proposing the gospel and offering people friendship with Jesus Christ, we're offering them as well the truth about human beings, the truth of who we are. I quoted Gaudium et Spes 24, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, paragraph 24. Paragraph 22, right before that, says that in Jesus Christ, we meet both the face of the merciful Father and the truth about our humanity. Christ reveals who God is, but he also reveals who we are. And who we are, in who we are, there are some givens. And living within those givens is what makes for a fulfilled and happy human life. So, if the theology of the body helps us get there in proposing the gospel to people, in explicating, I mean more in terms of explicating it. I don't think you start evangelization with the theology of the body. You invite people to meet the Lord Jesus, and if they're willing to do that, then everything follows from there.
Thank you.
But it's a very important part of